David tucked the comforter snugly around his son's small frame, leaning down to plant a soft kiss on Ethan's forehead. At 7 years old, bedtime was still accompanied by pleas for just a few more minutes of play and stories of imaginary friends. But eventually heavy eyelids would win out, and the boundless energy of daytime gave way to peaceful slumber. Tonight was no exception. Ethan's protests subsided after 2 bedtime tales, his breathing growing deep and steady. David watched his son's chest rise and fall for a few moments, then quietly made his way to the door. He paused with his hand on the light switch, taking in the sight of the sleeping boy one last time before bathing the room in darkness. "Daddy, wait!" Ethan's voice pierced the silence, tinged with a hint of panic. David sighed and flipped the light back on. "What is it, buddy?" Ethan was sitting up in bed now, the covers pulled around his waist. "Can you check for monsters under my bed?" His blue eyes were round with childlike worry. With a sympathetic smile, David walked back over and crouched down next to the bed. "Ethan, how many times do I have to tell you? There are no such things as monsters." He peeked under the bed anyway, pushing aside a few stray toys and dust bunnies for effect. "See? Nothing there. Just the dust monsters." Ethan giggled at his father's joke, but still looked unconvinced. "Are you sure? Sometimes I hear noises at night. Like whispers." David ruffled his son's hair. "It was just the wind or the house settling. Tell you what, I'll leave the hall light on tonight. That way you won't get scared if you wake up. You promise the monsters won't get me?" Ethan's eyes were already drooping again. "I promise. No monsters on my watch." David smiled and stood up. This time Ethan burrowed back under the covers without protest. As David's hand hovered over the light switch once more, his eyes were drawn to the narrow gap beneath the bed. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw the darkness move. A whisper seemed to flutter up from the shadows. David shook his head, dismissing the tricks of an overtired mind. With a definitive click, the room was plunged back into darkness. The only remaining light filtered in from the hallway, casting a dim rectangle on the floor. David pulled Ethan's door almost closed and walked down the hall to the living room. It was just past 9, but he could already feel the tug of drowsiness. It had been a long week filled with deadlines at work. He settled onto the sofa, contemplating whether to indulge in some mindless TV or head straight to bed. Just as he picked up the remote, an urgent whisper seemed to fill the quiet living room. "Daddy!" David jumped, the remote clattering to the floor. That was Ethan's voice again, crystal clear yet distant at the same time. "Ethan?" David stood up cautiously, his pulse quickening. Had his son gotten out of bed and snuck down the hall? But the house remained still and silent. After a long moment, David moved slowly down the hall. Ethan's door stood ajar now, though he was certain he had left it nearly closed. Heart thumping, he nudged it open wider. In the semi-darkness, he could make out Ethan's sleeping form, covers rising gently with the boy's breaths. Letting out a shaky exhale, David pulled the door shut again. Just my imagination, he told himself. Ethan had never learned to whisper that loudly anyway. But as he turned to go back to the living room, that disembodied voice filtered out again. "Daddy, I'm scared." A pitiful whimper, unmistakably Ethan's but seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Icy fear trickled down David's spine. Gripped by a sudden, protective instinct, he burst back into Ethan's bedroom, flipping on the overhead light. Ethan was sitting upright in bed again, his hair mussed and eyes blinking against the harsh glare. "Daddy, what's happening?" he asked tremulously. David swept his gaze around the room, searching for anything amiss. But only Ethan's familiar possessions greeted his roving eyes. He moved to the closet and yanked it open. Nothing but clothes and toys. Dropping to his knees, he scanned under the bed again. Only dust. Finally, he went to Ethan and gathered his shaking form into his arms. "It's okay, buddy. Just a bad dream." Guilt mingled with relief as Ethan clung to him. Had he imagined those pleading whispers? But they had sounded so real. Ethan eventually settled back under his covers, reassured by his father's presence. David sat watching over him until the boy's eyelids grew heavy once more. Only after Ethan's breathing deepened into the rhythms of sleep did David force himself to walk again to the door. His hand froze on the light switch as a whisper drifted up from under the bed. "Daddy, there's someone on my bed." David's breath caught in his throat. That was Ethan's voice again, but this time the real Ethan was asleep right in front of his eyes. He turned his head agonizingly slowly toward the bed. Two wide blue eyes stared back at him from under the dust ruffle. As he watched in horror, a small hand reached out from the darkness below the bed, fingers grasping at the air. "Daddy, check for monsters. I'm scared," the thing under the bed pleaded, in Ethan's frightened tones. David's mind reeled, unable to accept the impossible reality. He blinked hard, but when he opened his eyes, the hand was still there, now clawing pathetically at the floor. His gaze darted back to Ethan, but the boy slept on, undisturbed. Steeling himself, David forced his rigid legs to carry him to the edge of the bed. His heart slammed against his ribs as he slowly lowered himself to the floor. Peering into the blackness under the bed, David's breath froze in his lungs. Huddled against the wall, eyes swimming with tears, was Ethan. An exact copy of his son stared back at him from the shadows. David's mind raced wildly, grasping for any logical explanation. His son's cries for help echoed through his thoughts, spoken in both voices now. But even as every protective instinct screamed at him to comfort the sobbing child under the bed, an unsettling feeling in his gut whispered that this was not his Ethan. "What do you want?" David choked out through numb lips. The doppelganger's bottom lip quivered. "Daddy, I'm scared. It's dark under here." David's resolve wavered at the innocent plea. The thing sounded just like his 7-year-old son, begging for his father's protection. He hesitated, then slowly extended a trembling hand toward it. Just before making contact with its skin, the overhead light began to flicker. David froze as the doppelganger's eyes latched onto his outstretched hand with an unsettling intensity. Then the thing under the bed smiled. Not Ethan's gleeful grin, but a sinister twisting of lips that contorted its innocent features into something grotesque. "Daddy, why don't you join me under here?" it purred, in a guttural approximation of Ethan's voice. With a strangled gasp, David lurched backwards, crashing into Ethan's bedside lamp. It toppled to the floor and shattered. He cowered against the side of the bed, paralyzed with shock and horror as the menacing presence crawled out from under the bed. It cocked its head, surveying David with Ethan's sky-blue eyes. But behind that innocent facade, a malicious intelligence lurked. "What do you want?" David repeated hoarsely. The thing's lips split into another unnatural grin. "So many secrets buried in this house. In your mind? Why don't I take a look around?" David shook his head mutely, unable to form a coherent reply. His gaze darted to Ethan, praying his son would remain asleep and unaware through this nightmare. As if reading his thoughts, the doppelganger turned and scrutinized the sleeping boy. It reached out one pale hand to caress Ethan's cheek. "Don't touch him." David found his voice, the words ripping from his throat. He grabbed the thing's wrist, shocked at how solid and real it felt. The doppelganger turned back to David, its stolen face contorting in annoyance. Then its gaze latched onto David's hand, gripping its arm. "How interesting." It tilted its head again, studying his white-knuckled grip with unsettling fascination. "You really would do anything to protect him, wouldn't you?" David's breath came in panicked gasps as the light continued to flicker overhead. He couldn't bring himself to reply, couldn't give this entity any more information to use against him. "I've touched a nerve." The doppelganger's lips curled into a smile once more. "Let's see what other nerves I can uncover tonight." With surprising strength, it wrenched its arm from David's grasp. He lurched forward, trying to recapture the thing that wore his son's face. But it evaded him easily, moving with preternatural speed to the bedroom door. There it paused, gazing back at David with an expression that chilled his soul, Ethan's innocent smile distorted by a demonic hunger. "Shall we take a stroll down memory lane?" With those chilling words, it vanished into the hallway. "No, wait!" David stumbled to his feet, swaying as terror and adrenaline threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't let that thing roam freely through his home, his mind, revealing God knows what secrets. After placing a trembling kiss on the real Ethan's forehead and whispering a prayer for his continued sleep, David forced himself to follow the doppelganger. Each step took enormous effort, his legs leaden with bone-deep dread. The door at the end of the hall stood ajar. David didn't need to look inside to know what room it was. He squeezed his eyes shut, suppressing the flood of memories and emotions. But he had no choice. Steeling himself, he stepped over the threshold into the nursery. His gaze immediately snapped to the crib along the far wall. An overwhelming ache seized his heart. It looked exactly as it had 7 years ago, preserved as a memorial. The doppelganger stood beside the crib, running a hand lightly over the railing. It glanced up as David entered, flashing a razor-sharp grin. What a fascinating room! So many memories and regrets. It traced a finger over the name painted on the wall and swirling blue letters Noah. David staggered under the weight of anguish those 3 syllables triggered. He clutched the door frame for support. "Don't," he choked out. The thing pretending to be his son ignored the plea. With studied nonchalance, it reached into the crib and lifted out a stuffed lion. Noah's favorite toy. "How sentimental," it murmured, turning the plush animal over in its hands. "Keeping his room perfectly preserved for years and years. But it will never bring him back." It fixed David with an icy stare. "Will it?" David just shook his head mutely, overcome with grief and rage at this desecration of his first son's memory. The doppelganger tilted its head. "I wonder what secrets you've buried in here over the years. What failures you hide behind this mausoleum of innocence." It began opening drawers, sifting carelessly through their contents. It hummed and muttered to itself as if having a delightful time cataloging David's pain. Finally, David found his voice. "Get out," he rasped through clenched teeth. The thing paused and looked at him. For a heartbeat, its expression became puzzled, almost human. "But don't you want to remember him?" It glanced down at the stuffed lion cradled in its hands, then back at David. In that moment, its eyes held nothing but innocent curiosity. Despite himself, David felt hot tears spill down his cheeks. In his mind's eye, he saw Noah as a baby, giggling as he waved that same stuffed lion. The memories cut like knives. The doppelganger observed his breakdown with detached fascination. Then its lips twisted into a grin once more. "How interesting," it purred, all innocence gone. It strode closer to David, still clutching the stuffed animal. "Your anguish runs so deep. What else might I uncover?" It brushed past David into the hall, trailing a hand mockingly across his shoulders. David shuddered at its touch but found himself paralyzed by grief. Through the hallway and down the stairs the thing went, compelled by some perverse hunger to unearth more pain. Step by tortured step, David followed. He moved like a man in a nightmare, incapable of changing course or waking up. The doppelganger had made its way to the living room now. It strolled along the mantel, trailing fingers over the family photos displayed there. "What a lovely family," it said. "It seems you've recovered so well from past hurts. Built yourself a new life from the ashes." It paused on the most recent portrait, David and Ethan on a fishing trip, grinning proudly at the camera. With nimble fingers, the thing slipped the photo out of its frame and let it flutter to the ground. The glass cracked, spiderwebbing across their smiling faces. David lunged forward with a guttural cry, grabbing the thing by its shoulders. For the first time, rage overpowered his dread. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, giving it a hard shake. "Just leave us alone." The doppelganger's smile disappeared, replaced by a look of intense curiosity. It reached up and wrapped Ethan's small hands around David's wrists. David cringed but found himself unable to pull away from its grip. "So much pain," it marveled. "But still some light remains." Its blue eyes latched onto David's with startling intensity. "Tell me, if it came to it, would you sacrifice yourself for this new family you've built?" David stared back, mesmerized and revolted. "Of course," he whispered. The thing's eyes gleamed with renewed hunger at his words. It opened its mouth to speak again when a creak from the stairs froze them both. David's head jerked up. Framed in shadow at the top of the stairs stood Ethan, clutching his favorite stuffed bear. David's heart seized. How long had his son been awake, witnessing this living nightmare? "Ethan, go back to your room," David ordered urgently. The doppelganger twisted sharply, fixing its stolen eyes on the boy. Ethan stood paralyzed for a moment. Then he turned and fled back down the hallway. With a snarl, the thing shoved David aside and gave chase. Heart in his throat, David scrambled after them. He caught a glimpse of Ethan's small form darting through his bedroom door. But just as David reached the threshold, the door slammed shut in his face. David grabbed the knob and turned with all his might. But the wooden door refused to budge, as if barred from the other side. "Ethan!" David cried hoarsely, terror freezing his blood. He beat against the unyielding door until his fists ached. A scream pierced the air from within the bedroom, but was abruptly, ominously silenced. David thudded his shoulder desperately against the door, which stood immovable as stone. Dread at what might be happening on the other side threatened to suffocate him. "No!" David hurled his body against the door again and again. But it was useless. Whatever malevolent force controlled it would not relent. David sank to the floor, pressing a palm against the door as tears tracked down his face. Sobs racked his frame. After everything, he had failed again to protect his child. At that moment of despair, a strange sensation rippled through David's hand. A glow seemed to emanate from his palm where it touched the door. The wood itself felt suddenly insubstantial, as if it were no more than a projection. David stared in wonder as his hand began to sink into the door. The grain of the wood swirled around his skin like smoke. Somehow, impossibly, the barrier was yielding to his touch. Hope and desperation flooded through David. Gripping the door handle, he poured every ounce of strength and will into moving forward. The doorway resisted him for a moment. Then, with the sound of splintering wood, it gave way. David tumbled forward onto the bedroom floor. No scattered toys or furnishings greeted him. Instead, he found himself in a vast dark void, empty except for swirling wisps of shadow. Heart pounding, David whirled around searching for any sign of his son. "Ethan!" he shouted into the abyss. At first only silence answered. But then, so faint he thought he imagined it, came a terrified sob. "Daddy!" David turned toward the sound. There, barely visible through the roiling shadows, was Ethan. The boy lay collapsed on the non-existent floor, chest heaving with panicked cries. In 3 strides David was across the void and sweeping Ethan into his arms. He clutched the trembling child like a lifeline, relief crashing over him. Ethan was real, solid and unharmed in his embrace. The shadows around them churned.